The companions of our childhood always possess a certain power over our minds which hardly any later friend can obtain. This quote from Frankenstein is such an accurate and powerful statement about the human condition. Just ask any gamer what the best games of all time are, and in all likelihood, their list will be composed mostly, if not entirely, of the games they played in their formative years, the first games they fell in love with. And sometimes games, like poor Frankenstein's monster, are the brilliant creations of brilliant minds that, for one reason or another, are fated to be undesired, unfulfilled, and ultimately misunderstood. Titanfall 2 was developed by Respawn Entertainment and released on October 28, 2016, a year with some seriously stiff competition among first-person shooters. The world was blessed with the revival of the Doom franchise and a remaster of Modern Warfare, AAA endeavors such as Battlefield 1 and Far Cry Primal, and the hotly anticipated release of high-potential newcomers like Overwatch and Superhot. Not to mention, there had to have been a new entry in that one franchise. You know the one I mean, surely. The first-person shooter equivalent of Madden, the one that's, we'll say, for the birds. The series where the publisher would literally do anything to avoid a year of missed sales, even if it means employing 3 different game studios to perpetually reuse, recycle, and reiterate on content from nearly 2 decades ago, in what we'll generously call their 3 arches of game design, played so safely that the next pre-order will come with literal baby bumpers, just so that they can revel in mediocrity ad infinitum. Ward. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, right. Titanfall 2 launched in a brutally competitive year, but that didn't stop it from swinging for the fences. Respawn's goal with Titanfall 2 wasn't just to tread water in an oversaturated market, but to stand up to the industry and deliver a product that would not only go toe-to-toe with its contemporaries, but leave a permanent mark on the genre's fabled history. In that respect, its greatest adversary at this point is hindsight, and the years between its initial release and now. So, how does this Game of the Year contender hold up? Is it truly great? Or was it just great for the time? Side note, this deconstruction will be exclusively covering the Titanfall 2 single-player campaign experience, as covering the legendary story behind its multiplayer mode would be vastly exceeding the scope of a project like this. The core dynamic at play in the Titanfall 2 narrative is that of a militia group versus the IMC Corporation and their mercenaries. The big bad corporation has become as comically powerful and morally bankrupt as late-stage capitalism will allow for when drawn to its logical conclusion. The elimination of meaningful governments, highly futuristic technologies, general control over not just the bulk of humanity, but also everything within the human domain. Or something like that, anyway. You see, despite Titanfall 2 being the second game in its series, the first Titanfall was a functionally multiplayer-only experience with very little world building or lore to extrapolate from. That didn't stop Respawn from using Titanfall 2 to dump the player directly into the world with almost no context or explanation, though. The game itself starts out with a brief tutorial disguised as a typical training segment, but before class is finished, main character Jack Cooper has crash-landed onto a hostile planet and been thrust rather unceremoniously into the role of a pilot with his own Titan, known as BT. What starts out as a rookie pilot fighting for their mere survival escalates into that same pilot taking on an increasingly important role in the war between the IMC and the militia. The stakes continually and rapidly rise throughout the story until concepts like the subjugation of mankind and the obliteration of entire planets are brought to bear. Concepts which, by the way, are treated with the same introspection and gravitas that one might expect from a summer blockbuster at the turn of the century. Seriously, if someone told me the plot of Titanfall 2 was a Will Smith movie from 2003, I wouldn't even bat an eye.
I'm kinda busy, BT.
In the beginning of the game, each new level begins exactly where the previous one left off, but this stops happening about halfway through the game, and it makes a noticeable impact on the narrative throughline. It has a negative effect on the immersion as well as the cohesion of the story. It makes the player stop feeling like the pilot themselves, but someone who is just along for the ride as they watch Cooper get shuffled from set piece to set piece. We'll come back to this a little later. For now, let's just not pretend that Titanfall's narrative is particularly great. It's not. It's uninspired, it's fairly generic, and it's just risk-averse sci-fi. The characters are one-dimensional, and the dialogue is Diet Marvel-era Whedon at best.
On a hot streak.
Your vitals do not indicate a temperature problem. Do you wish for me to investigate this hot streak sensation further?
Still, it's inoffensive, the plot is serviceable, it functions, it does its job, which is facilitating the character and, by extension, the player from one spectacular moment to the next in a fairly reasonable manner. The interactions between Cooper and BT are the definite highlight, but even those are nothing that haven't really already been fully explored in this and other mediums.
Objection. Cooper is my pilot. Our combat effectiveness rating now exceeds 90%. Request permission to retain this link.
The fact that many of the dialogue choices offer multiple options does create a slightly more intimate experience, but it's not like even here there's anything particularly meaningful on display. The player can choose witty option A or witty option B.
It's just an expression, BT. It means I've been killing a lot of enemies quickly.
If Titanfall 2 were a movie, it would be lovingly referred to as a popcorn movie. The experience is enjoyable because of its spectacle, not because of any novel approach to storytelling or even the context of that story. And honestly, that's absolutely fine. Titanfall 2 is not a story-based game. It is not an RPG, it is not a visual novel, and it is not an open-world sandbox action game with a tremendous amount of time to spend on environmental storytelling and world-building. It is a lean, short, and tightly tuned action game that knows where its bread is buttered and it stays in its lane. For the most part. You see, there was this one thing that I can't.
Overpopulation of any colonized world.
Do not do exposition like this in a game like this. Even if the monologue was well written and made enough fair points that I nodded along in agreement with the villain, and it was, and I did, this is a terrible way of delivering plot in the context of an action game. Asking for the player to sit still and provide their undivided attention while also giving them full control of their character and nothing else to do for this long is genuinely frustrating. It feels forced and lazy and contrived. If this content was important enough to be included in the game, then it deserved to be more than just a painfully long audio log. Something like this would be much better off if it were executed in a cutscene, or in a non-action based but actually playable segment, or at the least, broken up into several different audio logs throughout the course of the game. I understand this information is an entirely optional part of the experience, but it's also a not insignificant part of the story and a major insight into the enemy that Cooper and the militia are fighting against, why they are doing so, and what the enemy is planning. It raises the stakes and shows that the story goes far beyond just Cooper and his survival. This is another example of how the story felt immersion breaking that I mentioned earlier. This audio log doesn't feel like its placement in the game was thoroughly considered and carefully placed to facilitate the narrative and the pacing. Instead, it feels like it was just shoved thoughtlessly in between set pieces so that the discerning player could have at least some context for what might be happening, which, frankly, is how most of the story feels. It doesn't exist for its own sake, but just to serve a purpose. After all, bad guys aren't just gonna shoot themselves. Whatever, it's fine. It's whatever. I'm just saying, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. There is always a certain challenge when analyzing the visual elements in games that were designed to be cutting edge, pushing the envelope for what was considered possible at the time of release. When a game goes all in on the technological wow factor, sometimes critical elements like art direction and stylistic choices are forced to take a back seat to things like photorealism and frame rate. The way in which these choices will cause a game to look aged will vary from project to project, but in most cases it doesn't end particularly well. Not so for Titanfall. Not only have the advancements in graphics technology been fairly minimal, relatively speaking, since the release of Titanfall 2, but it did make some important choices that helped it stand the test of time. As a result, the visuals hold up well enough. The game still looks pretty great, even if it's missing modern staples like ray-traced lighting and stupidly high-res textures. Great design choices, a solid bank of animations, a sleek UI, and a sharp focus on the visual elements it wants the player's eyeballs to prioritize give Titanfall 2 a clean look. even if it is filled with no small variety of textures and effects. Levels and level sections are partitioned with loading screens as required to maintain this level of graphical fidelity without compromising performance, which is an absolute must for a fast-paced first-person shooter such as this one. For the most part, the visual experience is refined, but there is one thing which stood out in a rather unflattering way, and that is how character model animations fail to consider level geometry. The easiest example here is in regard to the melee animations. Clearly a lot of effort was put into giving these attacks impact and style, especially the finishers. And when they work, they look great, and they feel awesome to execute. Unfortunately, the animations completely ignore the hitboxes of adjacent level geometry, and worse, this will often partially, and sometimes totally, break the camera. This takes something that should feel cool and immersive and turns it into something that's anything but. Like, what is that? What is that? It's 2016, not 1996. I realize adding context-sensitive animations based on character positions relative to the level geometry is a ton of work. But it's been done both before and since Titanfall 2, and it would have gone a long way here. Still, this is just a very noticeable blemish on an otherwise nearly spotless work of art. Titanfall 2 looks great. It is filled with interesting environments to traverse and do battle, a slew of iconic weapons, character designs with easily discernible silhouettes, and a whole host of other interesting and well-executed novelties. Not the least of which is, you know, the big f***ing robots. The music fits directly into Titanfall 2's mission statement of creating the pinnacle of a certain gaming experience. I alluded to this earlier when referencing how it's similar to a movie, and yeah, the audio is spot on for that too. It was probably extremely tempting to throw in some rock music or even, pun painfully intended here, heavy metal. Given the game's budget, they could have licensed or even commissioned a few tracks, a la Papa Roach's Getting Away with Murder for Mech Assault, or Breaking Benjamin's Blow Me Away for Halo. And there would have been nothing wrong with going that route. Those tracks helped to seed the bloom of hype for the games they were featured in and went on to become iconic parts of their respective franchises. This approach would have been an obvious choice and would have meshed well with the game's heavy emphasis on action and spectacle. A catchy, radio-friendly rock anthem could have even made the soundtrack more memorable and most certainly would have been a powerful marketing tool. And let's be honest here, it didn't even really have to be radio-friendly. Just look what Mick Gordon did for the Doom franchise. The very same year that Titanfall 2 released, in fact. Respawn had different plans, however. The music in Titanfall doesn't want to be catchy or memorable or fun. It doesn't want to be cool. It wants to be epic. It takes the game seriously, it takes itself seriously, and it wants the player to do so too. The serious tone and heavy atmosphere are always the priority. Orchestral percussion, tense strings, and big horns are combined with large flourishes and drawn-out harmonics to create moments of tension, suspense, and occasionally triumph. The result is a soundscape much more reminiscent of a movie than the traditional video game OST. To be fair, the soundtrack emulates Titanfall 2's larger-than-life presence and strives to help it reach its larger-than-life ambitions. Whether or not this resonates with players is going to depend heavily on why they're playing the game to begin with. Those who were looking to escape to a sci-fi world where a rebel faction of humanity has banded together to wage an interstellar war against an unethically powerful mega-corporation will likely find the music befits the scenario. Those who just wanted to blast their way through hordes of enemies in bipedal war machines and zip around like a Mountain Dew-fueled John Wick doing parkour may have preferred something a bit more kinetic to accompany their righteous fury. As far as the voice acting is concerned, the legend himself, Matt Mercer, turns in a performance befitting the game as main character Jack Cooper.
BT, how do I get to you?
And Glenn Steinbaum helped to bring BT to life with the iconic delivery one would expect from a combat robot/AI.
You must follow the pipes to the lower levels. Warning, losing contact.
The rest of the sound design in Titanfall 2 is, in a word, immaculate. From the gunfire to the explosions to the crunching of stressed metal as one Titan lays into another with a punch to the alloy face, there is always a satisfying weight to the sound effects. There is also a strong emphasis on clarity. The volume of a chaotic battlefield could easily become an overwhelming wall of indecipherable noise, but Titanfall goes to great lengths to avoid this issue. The sound profile of each gun and each enemy type and each Titan is distinct and supported by specific audio cues associated with them. Audio cues such as, for example, the dialogue between soldiers. The way that allied and enemy squads react to the character and how various situations unfold is some of the most natural sounding and immersive chatter ever showcased in the genre, while also being very informative for the player.
Pin double O, we're taking casualties! 114 pilot spotted! Weapons free! Keep him trapped, he will not get away!
This and other examples make it clear that the developer took pride in considering more subtle details. Things such as the HUD and UI elements, like reloading or when active camouflage comes off cooldown, but even infrequent and fairly inconsequential actions, such as hacking with the data knife or using the arc welder, are all made to feel important and are functionally informative. Without a doubt, Titanfall 2 is a masterclass in sound design. The style and the artistic direction may not be for everybody, but no one can argue about the production quality. If one element of Titanfall 2 stands out among the rest, it is undoubtedly the gameplay. Many of the fundamental elements of the first-person shooter on display in this game are, simply put, best in class. The top-notch shooting, the variety of weapons, enemies and types of encounters ensures that absolutely nothing in the game's campaign feels repetitive. The elegant feedback systems and the movement. Oh my goodness, the movement. We'll come back to all of this and more very soon. But in addition to those things, Respawn has also chosen to tackle several other game design concepts, each with varying degrees of competency. These include things like quote-unquote vehicular combat via the Titans, dynamic level design that can change with player interaction or even without it, and the usually dreaded NPC sidekick. It's a lot to unpack, but there's only one way to eat an elephant, so let's. The pilot movement in Titanfall 2 is hands down its most original and, in my opinion, engaging feature. The character is just so agile and responsive with a full toolkit of seamlessly integrated options at their disposal. The player can cycle between running, sliding, jumping, double jumping, wall running, and even bouncing from wall to wall endlessly and in any order, all while maintaining their full arsenal of offensive capabilities. Aim, shoot, throw grenades, or throw punches, and without ever even slowing down. In fact, many of these things actually provide small bursts of acceleration. Not only does it just feel really good, but the game makes explicit mention that this dramatically increases the character's survivability, which, yeah, that makes sense. A moving target is harder to hit than a still one, and a fast-moving target all the more so. What makes this brilliant is that it incentivizes the player to string together as many combinations of movement tech as they can, as often as possible. The design choice to make Titanfall 2's most innovative and addictive feature also one of its most powerful and rewarding cannot be understated. I was hooked before I even left the tutorial. That is not a joke. The tutorial is an extremely lean affair, requiring less than a single minute to complete. But that didn't stop me from repeating it over and over for well over an hour, trying to shave milliseconds off my best time. Never before or since have I played a shooter that made me feel like an apex predator in quite the same way that Titanfall 2 has. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how you do a gameplay loop. This is exactly what Halo developer Jamie Griesmer was talking about in his now famous 30 Seconds of Fun design philosophy. If my tutorial testimonial isn't enough, then perhaps there is no better example of this fact than knowing that this is a game in which the player can regularly choose to pilot a giant mechanized robot, capable of eliminating entire enemy squads effortlessly, yet the player feels just as, if not even more powerful and capable outside of that Titan. It would even be fair to go so far as to say that the pilot gameplay is so good that it can even undermine the Titan gameplay. While the Titans do feel powerful, yes, they also feel cumbersome and slow and a bit awkward by comparison. Are they still fun? Yeah, of course they are. They're a blast. Are they capable of getting the job done? Also, yes. But just not with nearly as much fluidity or player choice or skill expression. This is further exacerbated by higher player competency as well. The skill ceiling for Titan gameplay is tragically low when measured against the impossibly high ceiling for an on-foot pilot. But that's enough about the Titans for now. We'll come back to those later. So the pilot movement is obviously great, but what is a first-person shooter without gunplay? In this regard, there are no small number of things that a player should expect from any game in the genre, and countless things going on under the hood to satisfy those expectations. Accuracy versus precision, projectile velocity versus impact, hit scan response, perceived as well as actual recoil, hitboxes, and distinct and noticeable differences in all of these things and more with each different weapon. Suffice to say, Respawn is among the very best in the business for a reason. The guns do what you expect them to do pretty much without fail, and they do so in a way that is apparent and viscerally satisfying. This may seem like an incredibly obvious statement, but it is a critical aspect to the genre where a shamefully large amount of other games miss the mark. And yes, that pun was intended too. The point is, all of the game's weapons feel not only how they should, but really good. Really, really good. Great, even. A big part of this is the mechanical operation of the weapons, but one often overlooked and yet very important part of how weapons feel is the feedback they give. This can include things like their animations and their sound effects, but that's just one layer. Peel back the layers further, and there are finer details to appreciate. The targeting reticle lights up when a shot connects, which coincides with a satisfying little sound effect. Enemies can be staggered in various ways depending on where and what they are shot with, up to and including blowing their helmets clean off with a headshot. The whole feedback system combines to accentuate the player's perceived impact at any given moment and cranks the gunplay up to a level that is immensely rewarding. In addition to feedback, there was another somewhat subtle aspect to the FPS that Respawn really got right. Too many games, from inside and outside of the genre actually, are so concerned with every player spending what the developer has deemed to be an adequate amount of time with the variety of weapons that they slaved over modeling, animating, and balancing, that they will introduce artificial and unnecessary ammo shortages to force variety upon the player. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes this can be a good thing, as power weapons clearly have to have some kind of limitation, but also because this allows players to experiment with weapons and tools they may otherwise avoid, and which may have certain fantastic use cases or simply seem counterintuitive at first but are actually great. However, this is a line it seems many developers straddle with all the grace of a insert clever metaphor here, and the end result is actually the removal of player choice and agency, which not only defeats the purpose, but goes on to be downright counterproductive. So, thank you, Respawn, for providing the player with a fairly large pool of weapons to choose from, while also respecting them enough to let them use the ones they are most comfortable with the majority of the time. And to be clear, there really is no shortage of fun weapons to use, nor is there a shortage of enemy types to use them on. Pistols, submachine guns, assault rifles, shotguns, explosives, snipers, energy weapons, it's all here. Humans, robots, humans with shields, bigger robots, small robots that explode, normal size robots that explode, robots that can be hacked, and of course, Titans. Everything with its own flavor profile and possibilities for interaction. The important thing is that it isn't just variety for variety's sake. Things feel different from each other in a meaningful way, which enhances the game's depth and its replayability. A similar approach is taken with Titanfall 2's level design. A whole lot of different things are thrown at the wall, and just about everything sticks. There are the expected tropes, and there are also some more creative offerings. The game may start out with squad shootouts in the jungle, sniper sections with long sightlines, and messy firefights in a rainy city block, but the experience goes on to include a bit of the more spectacular. There's a gigantic factory that is fabricating entire neighborhoods, a military project under construction in the mountains above the clouds, and even a facility with time-space distortions. The important thing is that regardless of setting, the level design and the encounter design inform one another. At no point does the action suffer for the sake of spectacle. Similarly, the set pieces, skyboxes, and original locations never feel like their potential is unrealized due to limitations with the game's mechanics. Art and design are both given room to breathe, but also married in a way that elevates the overall experience. A great example of this is the manufacturing level mentioned previously. This level is really smart. It's clever. Moving parts, heavy machinery, conveyor belts, large structures to run and fight under, on, in, and through. It's an interesting concept that fits within the lore and the tone of the universe and just happens to be a perfect playground to set the player loose and allow them to limit test the unique things they're capable of within said universe. My only gripe is that it ends too soon. I feel like it would have been an excellent opportunity to pump the brakes on combat for just a minute and focus on the pilot's mobility and platforming by offering up some truly challenging platforming sections. I understand wanting to keep the player in the action, steadily progressing, and the focus that the game puts on catharsis and visceral satisfaction. Under that philosophy, it does make sense not to risk frustrating or alienating some players with a difficult platforming section. And that was most definitely the philosophy here. This is abundantly clear based on how resets from failure are extremely forgiving, wherein the player is sent immediately back to right before they died with no other penalty whatsoever. There usually isn't even a load screen. But this kind of just makes my point even more legitimate. Respawn could have really cranked up the creativity and intensity here with very little downside, and the choice not to feels like a missed opportunity. The press button to time travel level left me thinking many of the same thoughts. The concept is great. Hopping back and forth in between two different times but at the same place is certainly not a new concept, but what Titanfall 2 does to put its spin on things is make it a part of the level's encounter design as well. Generally speaking, a game will use the time travel mechanic to put a twist on simple exploration. Blinking from the future to the past across a bridge before it's broken, or traveling into the future when the security system has been disabled. Yeah, that's good stuff. But it's also a bit static. It is what it is, and the player's options are binary. It can be used for clever design, sure, but it's not a particularly high-stakes experience on its own. Respawn took it to the next level with Titanfall 2, though. By having two battles play out in parallel across two different timelines, the experience transcends a simple thought experiment and becomes a highly dynamic activity that the player can not just experience, but participate in. The player might find themselves with their back against the wall, so they hop into the alternate timeline to catch their breath, only to find the cycle repeating itself. It's very cool, but just like the factory level, the fun feels like it ends too soon, and there were obvious unexplored possibilities just waiting to be discovered. Including platforming sections and the time travel gimmick is a novel concept in the FPS genre, but just like the non-time travel platforming sections, no significant risks are taken. There is no incentive from the developer for the player to push their mental boundaries, to encourage thinking outside the box, and there are no particularly clever or precise segments. There's just enough here for the player to go, huh, neat. Does this make these levels bad? No, of course not. These levels are fantastic, and there is always a line that the developer should draw before they run an idea or a mechanic into the ground. All good things come to an end and whatnot. But in the case of these specific examples, it really feels like the line was drawn just a bit too early. Why stop at good enough or even great when Euphoria was just around the corner? This is a recurring theme with the whole of the game. Titanfall 2's biggest obstacle is itself. Always in such a hurry to show off its next cool concept or set piece, always so afraid to lose even a single player's interest for even a moment, that it doesn't always give itself the chance to live up to its full potential. Now, the game was released smack dab in the middle of the yellow paint renaissance, and sadly, it did not come out unscathed. The yellow paint isn't used a lot, but it's definitely there. The odd thing about that is, it never really feels necessary or even all that helpful. The architecture, lighting, and geometry were all created in a way that deliberately ensures that the player never really suffers from a lack of clarity about where they are or where they need to go next. Also, the levels are short and linear, and level sections are distinct. It's nearly impossible for a player to even go off course, but even if they do, it's only a matter of seconds to get back on track. Besides, with traversal being one of Titanfall 2's highlights, would doing a little exploration or backtracking really be so bad? I don't think so, and clearly Respawn didn't think so either, or they probably wouldn't have tucked away dozens of hidden collectible helmets throughout the game's campaign, urging the player to do exactly that. So, yeah, this may seem like the nittiest of nitpicks, but that's not really the point I'm making here. I'm not bothered by the inclusion of the yellow paint because it has almost no impact on the game whatsoever, but that's precisely why it seemed interesting enough to mention. Okay, fine. Let's talk about the Titans. So, yes, the Titans are cool. This doesn't really require any further explanation, does it? They are giant bipedal robot war machines a la Mech Warrior, Gundam Wing, or whatever your favorite Robo Gaiju series is. The idea itself will never not be cool. What matters is execution. So, how well does Titanfall 2 realize mechanized combat? Well, it's pretty good. Just like when running around as a foot soldier, the Titan combat offers a significant variety of weapons and abilities to cater to specific situations or playstyles without anything feeling redundant, but everything comes as part of a set. What that means is that a Titan's primary, secondary, and tertiary attack types, as well as their defensive ability and their mobility capabilities, are all swapped at once and are not interchangeable. These all-in-one packages are unlocked via story progression and can be changed on the fly at any time, but again, only in whole, not in part. It does feel great to wield such immense firepower, shred through enemy squads, and fell enemy titans. The Titan versus Titan gameplay is definitely the best part, and while I'm starting to feel a bit repetitive in saying this, I have to admit that I would have liked to see it expanded upon. There is very little benefit in swapping the Titan's components to meet the needs of a particular situation, which reduces player choice to a simple matter of preference instead of something more rewarding, such as strategy. One thing that was particularly delightful was the ability to hop in and out of the Titan at will. When the player exits the Titan, BT takes over control of it himself and fights alongside the character as an NPC companion. This isn't just set dressing either, the Titan is legitimately helpful, makes use of its unique abilities, and even does callouts.
I'm engaging hostile.
Simply having the option to swap back and forth seamlessly was a pleasant surprise on its own, and honestly must have been an incredible undertaking for the developer. But not only did they create significant player choice in this regard, they also had to develop level sections and encounters that would be equally interesting on foot as they are while piloting the Titan, and for the most part, they succeeded. It is a really impressive display of execution meeting vision, and it helps Titanfall 2 to carve out its identity. Things like this and the pilot's movement tech prove that Respawn created something more than just another highly refined shooter. They made something different and special, and most of all, fun. Titanfall 2 is proof that it takes more than peak design to find success in the video game industry. Yes, by some measures the game was successful, but not nearly to the degree that the developers aspired to, nor to the degree that they had achieved with their previous franchise, nor even to the degree of their contemporaries. Not every game requires a gripping narrative, and when the action is the focus, the most important thing a developer can do is ensure that the story doesn't interfere with the gameplay. And this is exactly what Titanfall 2 gets right. While the story may be a bit uninspired, the gameplay is anything but. The movement is sublime, and the Titan gameplay is pure catharsis. There is a heavy emphasis on variety. The player can use the guns, equipment, abilities, and Titan loadouts that they prefer. They can pilot the Titan at every possible opportunity or only when it's required. They can go slowly and methodically, brute forcing each encounter with raw firepower, or they can focus on speed and mobility. And everything has been polished up to the very highest of industry standards. Many people will undoubtedly appreciate Titanfall 2's extremely lean campaign and breakneck pace, but its pedal-to-the-metal approach to game design offers little room for some of its most interesting ideas to breathe, much less explore their full potential. It is not the Call of Duty killer that Respawn undoubtedly hoped it would be, but the biggest reason for that is probably because it tried to be in the first place. While it is undoubtedly great, the game suffers from a lack of confidence in itself and its audience. As much as I enjoyed the game for what it is, and I really did, I will always wonder what it could have been. What?